all this money we just made?
We definitely need to celebrate tonight.
I woke up in a hospital bed following emergency surgery, groggy and disoriented, reaching instinctively toward my left hand the way I'd done 100 times since Graham proposed 6 months earlier, only to find my finger completely bare. My engagement ring, an $18,000 heirloom-cut diamond Graham had spent nearly a year carefully saving for, was gone, and my mother, sitting calmly in the chair beside my bed, explained without a hint of shame that she and my father had sold it while I was unconscious to help cover the cost of my brother's upcoming milestone birthday party. Stick with me, because what my parents did while I lay in that hospital bed, and what I ultimately did once I recovered enough to fully understand the depth of their betrayal, would permanently, irreversibly change every single relationship in our entire family. My name is Billy Sutter, short for Wilhelmina, a name my grandmother insisted on before I was born and one I've carried, somewhat reluctantly, my entire life. I'm 29 years old, and 6 months before that devastating hospital discovery, my fiancé, Graham Dalton, had proposed to me during a quiet weekend trip, presenting a ring he'd spent nearly a full year secretly saving toward, a beautiful heirloom-cut diamond he'd chosen specifically because it reminded him of a ring his own late grandmother had worn throughout her 50-year marriage. I'd been admitted to the hospital rather suddenly following complications from what should have been a routine appendectomy, an unexpected infection requiring several additional days of hospitalization, and eventually, a second emergency surgical procedure that left me unconscious and disoriented for considerably longer than either Graham or I had initially anticipated when I'd first been admitted. My parents, Vernon and Doreen Sutter, had access to my apartment during that hospitalization specifically because I'd asked them, in a moment of genuine trust and vulnerability, to retrieve some personal items I needed during my hospital stay, access they apparently used, at some point during those difficult days, to locate my engagement ring, still sitting safely in its original box within my bedroom jewelry drawer, and sell it entirely without my knowledge or consent to a local jeweler for considerably less than its actual appraised value. To understand how my parents arrived at a decision so genuinely devastating, so calculated in its timing, you have to understand the considerable imbalance that had defined our family dynamics for nearly my entire life, an imbalance centered almost entirely around my younger brother, Corey, 26, who had occupied a position of consistent, largely unquestioned favor throughout our shared childhood, and continuing well into our adult years. Corey had always been the more outwardly charming, socially confident sibling, qualities our parents genuinely valued and consistently celebrated throughout our childhood, while my own quieter, more academically focused temperament received considerably less enthusiastic attention despite years of genuine, dedicated achievement throughout my own educational and eventual professional career as a physical therapist. Our parents had always found ways to celebrate Corey's milestones with considerable enthusiasm and financial investment, hosting elaborate parties for his graduations, his career achievements, even relatively minor personal milestones that, when I'd experienced similar achievements throughout my own life, received considerably more modest, understated acknowledgement from the same parents who apparently reserved their more significant celebratory energy specifically for their son rather than extending equivalent enthusiasm toward my own accomplishments. This pattern had continued steadily into our adult years, my parents' current preoccupation involving Corey's upcoming 30th birthday celebration, an event they'd been planning with considerable enthusiasm and, I would eventually discover, considerable financial ambition that exceeded what their own modest retirement savings could genuinely, comfortably accommodate without seeking additional funding from somewhere within our broader family resources. I'd noticed, throughout the months leading up to my hospitalization, my parents mentioning various details regarding Corey's planned celebration with increasing specificity and excitement, details involving a rented event venue, professional catering, and various other considerable expenses that, in hindsight, likely represented financial commitments exceeding what they could genuinely afford without seeking funding from some additional, unexpected source, a source they apparently identified. With genuinely shocking calculation, in my own engagement ring while I lay recovering from serious surgery, entirely unable to object or intervene. I remember the specific moment I first reached for my ring finger following that second surgery, the instinctive gesture I developed over 6 months of genuine, joyful engagement, a gesture that had become so automatic I barely consciously registered performing it throughout ordinary daily activities, checking simply to confirm the ring's continued presence the way someone might unconsciously check for their phone or wallet throughout an ordinary day. Finding my finger entirely bare triggered immediate, genuine alarm. My groggy, post-surgical mind initially assuming hospital staff had simply removed the ring for medical reasons related to swelling or surgical preparation, a common enough practice I'd actually anticipated and mentioned to the admitting nurse during my initial hospitalization, requesting specifically that any removed jewelry be carefully stored and returned once appropriate. "Mom," I said, my voice still groggy from anesthesia. "Where's my ring? Did the hospital take it off for the surgery?" My mother's response, delivered with a calm, matter-of-fact tone that genuinely stunned me once I fully processed its implications, revealed a betrayal considerably more devastating than any simple medical misplacement I'd initially innocently assumed. "Your father and I needed some additional funds for Corey's party," she explained, her voice carrying no discernible hesitation or shame throughout this explanation. "We knew you wouldn't mind helping your brother celebrate such a significant milestone, so we sold the ring to Otis at the jewelry shop downtown. It's for a good cause, sweetheart." I lay there in that hospital bed, still recovering from serious surgery, genuinely struggling to process what I was hearing, the specific, devastating combination of my parents' calculated timing, choosing a moment when I was entirely unconscious and unable to object, alongside the casual, almost dismissive manner in which my mother described selling an irreplaceable, deeply meaningful piece of jewelry that represented not just significant financial value but genuine emotional significance. Connected to Graham's own family history. Graham arrived at the hospital roughly an hour after this devastating conversation, having stepped out briefly to handle some work matters, entirely unaware of what had transpired during his absence. His own reaction upon learning the truth carrying a raw, genuine devastation that somehow validated my own difficulty processing the situation, confirming clearly that I wasn't overreacting to what genuinely represented a profound, calculated betrayal. "They sold it while you were unconscious," Graham repeated, his voice carrying disbelief that gradually shifted toward genuine anger as the full implications settled over him. "That ring belonged to my grandmother. It wasn't just valuable, Billy, it was irreplaceable. There's no amount of money that can simply buy back what that specific ring actually represented." I watched Graham's expression throughout that difficult conversation, recognizing genuine hurt beneath his controlled anger, understanding that my parents' calculated decision had damaged not just my own trust in them, but had also unavoidably complicated his own relationship with my family, a relationship he genuinely worked to build carefully and respectfully throughout our engagement, now fundamentally undermined by a betrayal that felt considerably more calculated and cruel than simple. Financial desperation might have otherwise explained. My parents, present in the hospital room throughout this difficult conversation with Graham, offered only minimal acknowledgement of the ring's specific sentimental significance, my father eventually suggesting, with a casualness that genuinely stunned both Graham and me, that we could simply get a new ring eventually, once our own finances allowed, language that revealed, unmistakably, exactly how thoroughly they'd failed to grasp or genuinely care about the specific irreplaceable meaning that particular ring had carried for both Graham and me throughout our engagement. I spent the remainder of that hospital stay processing genuine grief alongside my continued physical recovery, understanding gradually, throughout those difficult additional days, that my parents' betrayal represented something considerably more significant than a single isolated poor decision, instead reflecting a broader, long-standing pattern of prioritizing Corey's wants and celebrations over my own genuine needs and significant life milestones throughout our entire shared family history. I confronted my parents directly roughly a week after returning home from the hospital, once I'd recovered sufficiently to engage in the kind of difficult, emotionally demanding conversation their betrayal genuinely warranted, inviting them to my apartment specifically to discuss what had happened without the complicating presence of hospital staff or the general vulnerability of my earlier post-surgical state. "I need you to understand how devastating this was," I told them, my voice carrying a controlled intensity I'd spent the preceding week carefully preparing throughout considerable private reflection. That ring wasn't simply valuable financially. It represented Graham's grandmother's memory, our engagement, our future together. You sold it while I was unconscious, unable to object, specifically because you knew I would have said no if you'd asked me directly. My mother's response revealed a troubling lack of genuine remorse throughout that entire conversation, her explanations focusing repeatedly on Corey's specific need for a memorable, significant celebration, language that consistently minimized the actual severity of what they'd done while simultaneously, implicitly suggesting that my own objection reflected selfishness rather than any reasonable, legitimate response to genuine, calculated betrayal. "You're engaged now, you have Graham," my father said at one point during that difficult conversation, his tone carrying a dismissiveness that genuinely stunned me. "Corey doesn't have that kind of stability yet. We thought you'd understand wanting to help your brother during an important moment in his own life." I left that conversation with genuine clarity regarding exactly how thoroughly my parents had failed to recognize or acknowledge the actual severity of their calculated betrayal, understanding that whatever resolution I ultimately pursued would need to reflect not just this single, devastating incident, but the broader pattern of favoritism it had so clearly, unmistakably revealed throughout our entire family's history. I learned, through careful investigation over the following weeks, that my parents' betrayal extended considerably beyond simply selling my engagement ring, discovering additional details that painted an even more troubling, calculated picture regarding exactly how deliberately they'd planned and executed this specific act of financial exploitation during my hospitalization. I contacted Otis Farrow, the jeweler my mother had mentioned, learning directly from him that my parents had actually visited his shop twice throughout that period. An initial visit roughly 2 weeks before my hospitalization to inquire about the ring's approximate resale value, followed by the actual sale itself during my hospital stay, a timeline that revealed, unmistakably, that this wasn't any spontaneous decision made during a moment of genuine financial desperation, but rather a carefully planned action they'd apparently been considering and preparing for weeks before my unexpected hospitalization simply provided them the specific opportunity they'd apparently been waiting for. Otis, genuinely troubled once he understood the full circumstances surrounding the sale, explained that he'd purchased the ring for considerably less than its actual appraised value, roughly $11,000 rather than its genuine $18,000 worth, my parents apparently prioritizing quick, immediate cash over securing anything close to the ring's actual fair market value, a detail that made their calculated betrayal feel even more genuinely devastating once I understood how significantly they'd undervalued something so personally meaningful in their apparent rush to fund Corey's celebration. I also discovered, through a conversation with my aunt who maintained closer contact with Corey than I typically did, that my parents had specifically discussed the ring as a potential funding source with Corey himself weeks before my hospitalization, meaning my own brother had known throughout this entire period that our parents were considering selling my engagement ring to help fund his birthday celebration, and had apparently raised no meaningful objection whatsoever to this specific plan. I confronted Corey directly once I'd learned about his apparent prior knowledge regarding our parents' plan, a conversation that revealed considerably more troubling complicity than I'd initially hoped might be the case, genuinely wanting to believe my own brother wouldn't have knowingly allowed such a devastating betrayal to proceed without at least attempting to intervene or warn me directly. "I didn't think they'd actually go through with it," Corey said, his tone carrying more discomfort than genuine remorse throughout our difficult conversation. "I figured they were just talking, exploring options. I didn't realize they'd actually do it while you were in the hospital." "But you knew they were considering it," I pressed, genuinely needing clarity regarding exactly how much responsibility Corey himself bore for a betrayal that had, ultimately, directly funded his own upcoming celebration. "You knew, and you never said anything to me, never tried to stop them, never even gave me a warning so I could have protected my own property before this happened." Corey's response revealed, unmistakably, a troubling willingness to accept benefits secured through genuinely harmful means, provided he himself wasn't the one directly executing the harmful action, a moral distinction that felt, to me, considerably less meaningful than Corey himself apparently believed it represented. "I mean, once it happened, I didn't think it made sense to refuse the money," he admitted. "The party was already being planned around that budget." I recognized, throughout that difficult conversation, that Corey's complicity, while perhaps less directly calculated than our parents' own actions, nonetheless reflected the same broader pattern of prioritizing his own wants and celebrations over any genuine consideration for how his continued, comfortable acceptance of clearly harmful benefits might affect his own sister. I consulted with an attorney, Maricela Quinn, regarding potential legal options available given my parents' unauthorized sale of my personal property, learning that while pursuing formal legal action against one's own parents represented a genuinely significant, complicated decision with lasting family implications, I did possess legitimate legal standing to pursue either criminal theft charges or civil recovery, given the clear, documented circumstances surrounding the ring's unauthorized sale. I ultimately decided against pursuing formal criminal charges, understanding that whatever satisfaction such action might provide would likely come at the cost of any remaining possibility for genuine family reconciliation, choosing instead to pursue a formal civil demand for financial restitution reflecting the ring's actual, full appraised value rather than the diminished amount my parents had actually received from Otis's shop. Maricela drafted a formal demand letter outlining the specific circumstances and requesting full restitution of $18,000, the ring's genuine appraised value, providing my parents a clear, formal opportunity to acknowledge the severity of their actions through meaningful financial accountability, rather than the vague, dismissive apologies they'd offered throughout our earlier, informal conversations. My parents' initial response to this formal demand revealed continued, troubling minimization of the situation's actual severity, my father initially suggesting the demand represented an inappropriate escalation of what he continued characterizing as a reasonable family decision rather than the genuine, documented theft it legally, factually represented, a response that ultimately necessitated additional formal legal correspondence before my parents finally, reluctantly agreed to a structured repayment plan reflecting the ring's actual, full value. The formal legal process, while ultimately successful in securing meaningful financial accountability, created lasting significant strain throughout our broader family relationships, my parents expressing genuine resentment throughout the following months regarding what they characterized as my unforgiving response to what they continued, troublingly, minimizing as a reasonable family financial decision rather than genuinely acknowledging as the calculated betrayal it actually represented. My relationship with Corey remained genuinely strained throughout that same period. His own complicity in accepting clearly harmful benefits without meaningful objection creating a lasting rift that our previous, generally warm sibling relationship struggled considerably to overcome, despite his eventual, somewhat belated attempts at more genuine acknowledgement once he'd had additional time to process the actual severity of his own passive complicity. I used the restitution funds, once fully received through the structured repayment plan my attorney had negotiated, to purchase a new ring alongside Graham, choosing deliberately not to attempt recovering the specific original ring from Otis's shop, understanding that whatever new ring we chose together would carry its own genuine, meaningful significance separate from the painful circumstances surrounding the original ring's calculated, devastating loss. Graham and I married roughly a year after that devastating hospital discovery, my parents attending the wedding itself but with a relationship that remained genuinely, permanently altered by everything that had transpired, our interactions throughout that following year carrying a careful, guarded quality that reflected the genuine, lasting damage their calculated betrayal had caused to a trust I'd previously extended to them without significant reservation throughout my entire life. Standing at my wedding reception roughly 14 months after that devastating hospital discovery, wearing a new engagement ring alongside my wedding band, surrounded by genuine friends and the more distant, carefully guarded presence of my own parents and brother, I thought often about everything that had unfolded since that specific, devastating moment of waking up to find my finger bare and my mother's calm, dismissive explanation awaiting me. I'd learned, throughout that difficult year, something genuinely important about my own worth and the standards I was willing to accept from people who claimed to love me, recognizing that genuine family relationships require considerably more than simply sharing blood or history, requiring instead active, consistent demonstration of genuine respect and consideration that my own parents had, through their calculated betrayal, revealed they'd never fully, consistently extended toward me. Throughout years of quietly favoring my brother's wants and celebrations over my own genuine needs, Graham and I built our marriage deliberately around the kind of genuine mutual respect and consideration I'd learned, through painful experience, not to simply assume existed automatically within family relationships, understanding clearly that the partnership we were building together needed to reflect values my own family of origin had, ultimately, proven themselves unable to consistently demonstrate throughout my entire life leading up to that devastating hospital discovery. I maintained careful, limited contact with my parents and Corey throughout the following years, our relationship never fully returning to the warmth and unguarded trust that had characterized our family dynamics before that specific, calculated betrayal, but gradually, slowly rebuilding towards something considerably more honest and appropriately boundaried than the relationship I'd previously maintained, one built on realistic expectations rather than the genuine, ultimately misplaced trust I'd extended throughout my earlier years before finally fully understanding exactly what my own family was and wasn't genuinely capable of offering me in return.